Why did the radio feel heavier than usual that night, like it was waiting for something she hadn't prepared herself to carry? Elena Marquez had learned long ago how to read silence. After nearly 3 decades in emergency response, quiet wasn't peaceful to her. It was a pause before impact. The kind that lived in hallways at 3 in the morning, in the space between dispatch calls, in the look people gave you right before they said, "We did everything we could." She leaned back in the passenger seat of Rescue 3, hands folded loosely in her lap, fingers stiff from cold and years of repetition. The city rolled by in tired streaks of yellow and gray. Streetlights blinked awake. Storefronts darkened. The kind of night where nothing announced itself as dangerous. The kind that usually was. It was her final shift. She hadn't told many people. She didn't want speeches or hugs that lasted too long. No cake that tasted like cardboard. No forced smiles. She wanted to end it the same way she'd lived it, quiet, competent, invisible. Jarred behind the wheel, kept glancing at her like he was trying to memorize something before it disappeared. 27. Fresh certification. Still believed adrenaline was fuel instead of debt. "You're really okay with this?" he asked. "Just done?" Elena smiled faintly. "I'm okay with going home." The radio crackled before he could respond. Rear alley behind the Blue Dock Tavern. Unresponsive male. Possible assault. No weapon seen. Elena closed her eyes for half a second. Of course. Bar calls were where careers began and ended, where people bled quietly behind dumpsters while music thumped 10 feet away, where dignity went to die if someone didn't step in. She buckled in. "Let's keep it clean." Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew. Last calls were never clean. The alley smelled like old rain and regret. Beer, oil, wet cardboard. The man was slumped where the light didn't quite reach him, like the city itself had looked away. Elena saw the details instantly. Head wound, shallow breathing, hands rough, not homeless, not soft either, someone who used them hard and often. She knelt, checked pulse, tilted his chin. "Sir," she said gently, "can you hear me?" His lips moved. "Team." The word barely made it out. Something tightened behind her ribs. They lifted him carefully. Oxygen monitor load. That was when the voices came back. 3 men, drunk, angry, emboldened by the dark. "Don't take him." Elena stepped between them and the open ambulance doors without thinking. Her body knew this movement, had done it 100 times before. Protect the patient, be the barrier. "Walk away," she said. One grabbed her wrist. She twisted free. Another shoved jarred. And then, metal impact, the world snapping white. She went down hard. The pain didn't scream, it rang, high and distant, like a bell struck too close. Blood in her mouth, asphalt cold against her cheek. Her vision blurred, but she saw the stretcher still inside the rig, the patient still breathing. "Go," she whispered. Jarred hesitated. "Go." The siren rose as the ambulance pulled away without her. Elena lay back against the alley wall, rain mixing with blood, heart pounding slower than it should have. She didn't think about retirement. She thought about whether he'd make it. Sometimes the job doesn't end when the shift does. Sometimes it ends when you decide not to walk away. Why did the ceiling tiles look exactly the same after everything that had happened? Like the world hadn't noticed, she almost didn't get back up. Hospitals had a way of flattening time. Elena stared at the grid above her, counting breaths, counting heartbeats, waiting for the pounding behind her left eye to settle into something manageable. Concussion, fractured wrist, 9 stitches. Benched, the doctor had said gently. She didn't care. "Is he alive?" she asked, jarred the second he came into view. "Yes." The word hit her harder than the blow had. Later came the uniforms, quiet ones, no patches, no names. "Ma'am." They said it like it mattered. They told her he was alive, that he was Navy, that he was a medic. That when he whispered team, it wasn't confusion. It was trust. And when one of them said, "You didn't leave him," she felt something shift inside her, something old and tired and quietly proud. She hadn't known who he was. That was the point. Why would 12 men in dress blues stand in formation for someone who never wore a uniform? The ambulance bay was too quiet. Elena stopped short. 12 Navy SEALs, perfect alignment, no movement. Ryan Blake sat at the center, pale but upright. Chief Hale stepped forward. "Ma'am." The salute came together like thunder held in check. For a moment, Elena forgot how to breathe. She had been thanked before. This was different. This was recognition. Not for rank, not for medals, but for staying. For standing between violence and someone who couldn't stand anymore. They called her ma'am, not because she outranked them, but because dignity recognizes dignity. When they placed the coin in her hand, it felt heavier than metal. It felt earned. The parking lot was quiet when she finally left. No sirens. No radio. Just a woman with a brace on her wrist and a coin in her pocket that proved something she'd never needed proven before. She had spent her life unseen. And yet when it mattered most, she had been seen. Sometimes courage doesn't carry a weapon. Sometimes dignity doesn't raise its voice. Sometimes respect isn't given by rank. It's earned by staying when walking away would have been easier. And sometimes, the final shift isn't the end. It's the moment you realize who you've been all along. Why did the quiet feel louder than the sirens ever had, like the night itself was holding its breath? Elena drifted in and out before she realized she was awake. Sound returned first, not voices, not alarms, just a low mechanical hum that vibrated through her bones. The steady, patient rhythm of machines doing their work without needing thanks. The smell came next. Antiseptic, plastic, something faintly metallic, hospital air. It carried no judgment, only facts. Her eyelids felt heavy as if someone had glued them shut with exhaustion instead of sleep. When she finally managed to open them, the ceiling stared back, off-white tiles arranged in a grid so familiar it almost made her laugh. She had memorized these patterns over decades. Different hospitals, same ceilings, same promise. You made it here. For now. Pain announced itself slowly, like it didn't want to startle her. A deep throb above her left ear. A tight pulling sensation at her wrist. A dull ache along her ribs that reminded her how the ground had felt when it met her body too fast. She tried to move her left hand. Nothing happened. That scared her more than the pain. "Elena." Jard's voice cut through the fog, thin and sharp with worry. She turned her head slightly, winced, then focused on him standing just inside the curtain. His uniform was rumpled, stained near the knee. There was blood on one sleeve, hers, she realized distantly. "You're awake," he said quickly, like he'd been holding the words in. "Hey, you're okay, you're okay." She swallowed, her throat felt like sandpaper. "The patient," she rasped. Did you?" "Yes," he said immediately. "Yes, I got him there, County General, Trauma Bay. They took him straight in." Her eyes closed again, just for a second. Relief hit her harder than morphine ever could. It loosened something tight and aching in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the alley. "Alive?" she asked. Jard hesitated, just a fraction. "I think so," he said. "They were moving fast, real fast." That was enough. She nodded once. Her job had been to get him there breathing. Whatever came after belonged to someone else. A nurse stepped in quietly, efficient hands adjusting the IV line, checking her vitals without ceremony. Elena caught the practiced kindness in her eyes, the kind that came from someone who had seen too much to waste time on false cheer. "Mild concussion," the nurse said gently. "You're lucky. Another inch and we'd be talking skull fracture. Wrist is fractured. We've got it braced. 9 stitches above the eye. Alina stared past her, listening more to what wasn't said. You're done for the night, the nurse added, softer now, and probably a while after. Alina didn't argue. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel the reflexive need to apologize for being hurt. The curtain rustled again. A uniformed police officer stepped inside, older, calm, mustache gone gray at the edges. He held a clipboard like it was an extension of his arm. "Ma'am," he said, nodding respectfully. Officer reading. "Ma'am," the word registered, faint but distinct. "I just wanted to let you know the 3 suspects were apprehended," he continued. "Pick them up near the shipyard. They won't be bothering anyone tonight." Alina nodded. She didn't feel satisfaction, just a distant sense of completion, like a box checked on a form she didn't remember filling out. "Thank you," she said. Reading hesitated, eyes flicking briefly toward the curtain opening, then back to her. "The man you brought in, he's got people asking questions. Navy, high clearance, hospital security's locked down his room." Alina frowned slightly. "Navy." "Yes, ma'am." The word again. Something shifted in her chest, not pride, not fear, curiosity, the slow kind. The kind that settled in and refused to leave. After the officer left, Jard hovered awkwardly near the bed. "You scared me," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "You did fine." He shook his head. "You always say that, even when it's not true." She studied his face, the tight jaw, the sleepless eyes, the way his hands kept flexing like he still expected to need them. She remembered herself at his age. Thought exhaustion was temporary. Thought strength was endless. "You followed orders," she said. "That's what mattered." "You told me to leave you," he said. His voice cracked despite his effort to control it. "I didn't want to." "I know," she replied softly, "but you did anyway." That was the job. Sometimes leadership wasn't about staying. It was about knowing when to send someone else forward. Time blurred again after that. Nurses came and went. Forms were signed. Pain ebbed and returned in waves. Outside the narrow hospital window, the sky lightened from black to deep blue. Morning crept in without asking permission. Alina lay still, staring at the slow pulse of the heart monitor. She thought about the alley, about the man's hands, about the word he'd whispered. "Team." It echoed now, louder in memory than it had been in the dark. She wondered who he was, not his rank, not his job, who he was when no one was watching. What kind of life led someone like him into a wet alley behind a bar, bleeding and alone? And why, out of all the people in the city that night, her ambulance had answered the call? It was just after 3 in the morning when the atmosphere changed. She felt it before she saw it, the subtle tightening of space. The way sound seemed to dull around the edges, footsteps that didn't rush or wander, they moved with intention. The curtain shifted. A man stood there, tall and still, wearing a plain dark shirt and jeans that somehow looked more formal than most uniforms. His hair was cropped close. His eyes were sharp, assessing but not unkind. Behind him stood 2 others, younger, equally alert. None of them wore insignia. None of them needed to. "Ma'am," the lead man said quietly. Alina pushed herself upright slightly, ignoring the protest from her ribs. "Yes." "My name is Chief Petty Officer Hale," he said. "We're here about the man you treated tonight." Her heart picked up. "Is he alive?" "Yes," Hale replied without hesitation. "He survived surgery." She exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders all at once. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself together until that moment. "I'm glad," she said. "He was in bad shape." Hale studied her for a long moment, as if measuring something that couldn't be charted. "When you found him," he asked, "did he say anything?" She nodded. "One word, team." The effect was immediate, not dramatic but unmistakable. The three men stiffened slightly, like a current had passed through them. "That matters," Hale said quietly. "I thought he was disoriented," Alina admitted. "I didn't know." "That he trusted you," one of the younger men said, his voice tight. "Even then." Alina felt suddenly out of her depth. "I just did my job." Hale shook his head once. "No," he said, "you stayed." The word landed heavy between them. He nodded to her once, a gesture that carried more weight than any salute she'd ever seen. "When he wakes up, he'll want to know who didn't leave him." They left as quietly as they had arrived. Alina lay back against the pillow, staring at the curtain long after it settled. Her heart beat a little faster now, not from pain but from something else, something unfamiliar. She wasn't a soldier. She had never trained for combat, never carried a weapon. Her world was gauze and airway tubes and steady hands in chaos. And yet, somewhere in the city, a team she'd never met knew her name. Later that morning, unable to sleep and unwilling to go home just yet, Alina found herself wandering the halls with a borrowed gown and a stubborn ache in her side. She told herself she just wanted closure. Room 219. The nurse hesitated, then handed her a disposable gown without a word. Inside, the man lay propped up, bruised and stitched, chest wrapped tight. His eyes were open, alert, watching. "You're the EMT," he rasped. She smiled faintly. "That's me." He studied her, then huffed a weak breath that might have been a laugh. "Thought you'd be older." She raised an eyebrow. "I am." He tried to smile. It didn't quite work. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, unsure what to do with the sudden weight in her chest. "No one leaves the medic behind," he added quietly. Something clicked into place then. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet understanding. Alina had spent her life standing between chaos and strangers. She hadn't known she'd been part of a team all along. Sometimes purpose doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it shows up bleeding in an alley and asks you to stay. And sometimes staying changes everything. Why did the hallway feel longer on the way out than it ever had on the way in, like something was quietly following her steps? Alina stood outside room 219 longer than she meant to. The door was closed now, the nurse inside adjusting something, voices low and careful. She could still picture his face clearly. The bruising, the calm in his eyes despite the pain, the way he'd looked at her like she was a fixed point in a world that had gone unstable. She told herself she'd only gone in to check on him. Closure, that was the word she used. A neat one, professional, it fit on forms and discharge papers. But closure didn't explain the tightness in her chest as she turned away. She moved slowly down the hall, one hand grazing the wall for balance. Her body was beginning to register what the adrenaline had hidden, every step a reminder that she'd crossed a line between routine and consequence. She'd done that many times before, but this time felt different. He hadn't just been a patient. He'd been someone else's lifeline. And now, somehow, she was part of that equation. She stopped in the family lounge 2 floors down, the place people went when there was nothing left to do but wait. Plastic chairs, a muted television mounted too high on the wall, a coffee machine that smelled burned no matter how fresh the pot was. Alina sat in the corner, easing herself down carefully, the brace on her wrist stiff and unforgiving. She stared at the paper cup of water in her hand until it went warm. Her reflection in the darkened TV screen looked older than she remembered. Not weaker, just marked. For the first time since the alley, her hand started to shake. Not violently, just enough to notice. She closed her eyes and breathed the way she'd taught 1,000 patients to breathe. Slow in, slower out, control what you can, let the rest pass. She thought about all the times she'd walked away from scenes like that. The ones where violence hung in the air even after the lights were off. The ones she never talked about. The ones that followed her home and sat quietly in the passenger seat. She had always believed distance was protection, that if you kept moving, nothing could really touch you. But that night she hadn't moved. She had stayed. The door to the lounge opened softly. Alina didn't look up at first. She assumed it was another family member packing, another quiet tragedy unfolding somewhere down the hall. But then she felt it again, that subtle shift in the air, like the room had become more alert. Chief Hale stood just inside the doorway, alone this time. No jacket now, just a plain long-sleeve shirt. His posture was relaxed, but nothing about him was casual. He scanned the room once, then met her eyes. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She gestured to the empty chair beside her. They sat in silence for a moment, not awkward, just measured, the kind of silence shared by people who didn't waste words. "He's stable," Hale said finally. "Still a long road, but he'll make it." Alina nodded. "I'm glad." He studied her profile, the way her jaw tightened when she shifted, the faint tremor she didn't quite hide in her fingers. "You didn't have to go back up there," he said. "I know. But you did." She didn't answer that. There wasn't an explanation that wouldn't sound smaller than the truth. Hale leaned back slightly, hands resting on his knees. "You should know something," he said. "The situation in that alley wasn't random." Alina turned toward him. "The officer mentioned that." Hale nodded. The men who attacked him had been watching him for a while, not because of who he was officially, but because of what he did in the bar. "What did he do?" she asked. "He stopped something from escalating," Hale said. "Pulled another guy out of a fight that was turning ugly. Didn't throw a punch, just stepped in." Alina frowned faintly. That doesn't usually get someone followed into an alley. "No," Hale agreed, "but it does when the wrong people feel embarrassed." She thought back to the scene, the way the men had looked at the ambulance, the anger that felt personal, not opportunistic. "They were going to hurt him," she said quietly. "Yes," Hale replied, "and if you hadn't arrived when you did, they would have succeeded." The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. "You said he's a medic," Alina said after a moment. Hale's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "He is." "What does that mean to you?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if weighing how much truth she was ready to carry. "It means," he said slowly, "that when things go wrong for us, he's the one who makes them right. It means when someone's bleeding out in a place no one's supposed to be, he's the reason they see another sunrise." Alina swallowed. Her mind flashed with memories she'd never fully sorted through, hands pressing on wounds, voices calling out vitals, the moment where everything narrowed down to breath and pulse. "So when you stepped in front of him," Hale continued, "you weren't just protecting one man. You were protecting the person who protects the rest of us." Alina looked down at her braced wrist. The skin beneath the wrap was already bruising, dark and angry. "I didn't know," she said. "That's why it matters," Hale replied. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and placed it gently on the small table between them. Alina didn't touch it right away. "What's that?" she asked. "A number," he said, "and a name, mine." She finally unfolded it, neat handwriting, simple, 2 words written beneath the contact information. "Family now." Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "I'm not," she started. "I know," Hale said calmly. "You're not military, you're not trained the way we are, you don't wear what we wear." He leaned forward slightly. "But you understand the rule." She looked up. "What rule?" "No one gets left behind." The words echoed, something Ryan Blake had said upstairs. Hale stood, straightening his shirt. "You should go home," he added. "Rest, heal." Alina nodded. "I will." He paused at the door. "When you sign out tomorrow," he said without turning around, "don't be surprised if things feel different." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone. Alina sat there for a long time after that, the paper still in her hand. She didn't know when she started crying, only that she wasn't ashamed of it. She left the hospital just after sunrise. The sky was pale and washed clean, like the city had decided to start over without asking anyone's permission. Her car sat alone in the lot. She eased into the driver's seat carefully, wincing as her ribs protested. The radio was off. She didn't turn it on. As she drove home, the events of the night replayed in fragments. The alley, the impact, the word team. She realized something then, not with fear but with clarity. This hadn't just been her last shift. It had been a reckoning. At home, she slept for hours, her body finally giving in. When she woke, the pain was sharper, the bruises darker. Retirement paperwork sat untouched on the kitchen table. Her phone buzzed once. Unknown number. She stared at it for a long moment before answering. Alina Marquez, a familiar voice said on the other end. Ryan Blake's voice was still rough but steadier now. Yes. I just wanted to tell you something, he said. I remember you telling me to stay with you, in the alley. She closed her eyes. That was the first thing I heard clearly, he continued, before everything went dark. She swallowed. You did. There was a pause, then quietly, so I stayed. The call ended shortly after. No long conversation, no speeches. Alina set the phone down and stared out the window. She had spent her life believing that impact was measured in numbers, in response times, in outcomes logged and archived. But some moments refused to be filed away. Some moments followed you forward. And she had the sense, stronger now than ever, that this one wasn't finished with her yet. Why did the morning feel heavier than the night that nearly killed her, like the danger hadn't passed, only changed its shape? Alina woke to sunlight she didn't remember inviting in. It fell across the kitchen floor in a pale stripe, catching dust in the air and the edge of the table where her retirement paperwork sat untouched. For a few seconds, she didn't move. She lay still, listening to the quiet, waiting for the familiar crackle of a radio that would never come again. Her body answered first. Pain bloomed in layers. Wrist, ribs, head, not sharp enough to panic, not dull enough to ignore. The kind of pain that reminded you crossed a line and couldn't step back over it. She sat up slowly, bracing herself with her good hand. The room felt foreign in daylight. This was supposed to be her first morning free. No uniform, no schedule, no callouts. Instead, it felt like standing at attention without being told why. She made coffee and forgot to drink it, stood at the window and watched a delivery truck idle across the street. Life moved on with uncomfortable ease. People went to work. Dogs were walked. Somewhere, someone was laughing. She pressed her fingers to the stitches above her eyebrow, careful, almost reverent. Proof it had all happened. Proof she hadn't imagined the alley, the metal impact, the voice on the phone telling her he stayed. The phone buzzed again. This time, she answered without hesitation. "Ma'am," Chief Hale said, his voice calm, steady. "I hope I didn't wake you." "I was already up," she replied. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said. Then after a pause, "But something happening." She closed her eyes, leaned against the counter. "I figured." There was a faint sound on his end, wind maybe, an open space. "We're scheduled to leave the area later today. Before we do, the team wants to see you." Alina hesitated. "I don't need." "I know," Hale interrupted gently. "This isn't about ceremony." Silence stretched between them. "It's about closure," he added, "for all of us." She thought about the word, closure, the way people used it when they didn't know what else to call the feeling that followed survival. "When?" she asked. "Early afternoon," he said. "Hospital ambulance bay." She almost laughed. Of course it would be there, where everything in her life seemed to begin and end. "I'll be there," she said finally. After the call ended, Alina stood alone in her kitchen, staring at nothing. She realized she was afraid, not of the men, not of what they represented. She was afraid of what it would mean if she went. Fear, she'd learned, didn't always come from danger. Sometimes it came from being seen too clearly. She dressed slowly, choosing clothes that didn't draw attention. Jeans, a soft sweater, her wrist brace hidden under the sleeve. She debated covering the stitches, then decided against it. She had nothing to hide. The drive back to the hospital felt surreal. No urgency, no siren, just traffic lights and impatient drivers unaware that the woman beside them had ended a career on wet asphalt. She parked in the staff lot out of habit and realized it didn't matter anymore. Old reflexes died hard. As she walked toward the ambulance bay, she noticed movement behind the glass. People gathering, nurses, techs. A few faces she recognized from years of shared exhaustion and quiet triumphs. No one said anything. They just watched. The bay doors were open. 12 men stood inside. Dress blues, perfect lines. Shoes aligned with almost mathematical precision. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They simply were what they were. Ryan Blake sat at the center in a wheelchair, posture straight despite the way his face still carried the marks of violence. He looked thinner than before, paler, but his eyes were clear. Elena stopped just inside the threshold. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Chief Hale stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, voice carrying without effort. The word landed differently this time, heavier, final. Elena's breath caught. She hadn't prepared for this, not really. She hadn't known what closure looked like when it stood at attention in front of you. "You don't have to," she began. Hale raised a hand slightly, not commanding, respectful, "just listen." Ryan's voice followed, rough but steady. "I've been in a lot of bad places," he said. "Places where things don't go the way they're supposed to, where the rules don't apply." He looked at her, really looked at her. What happened in that alley wasn't supposed to happen, but it did, and because of you I'm still here. Elena felt her throat tighten. She shook her head faintly. "I didn't know who you were." "That's the point," Hale said quietly. Ryan continued. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't hesitate. You didn't wait for backup. You put yourself between violence and someone you didn't owe anything to." He swallowed. "That's the rule we live by." Hale stepped back into line. His voice rose slightly, not loud but firm. "For valor without weapon, for service without rank, for standing your ground when it would have been easier to walk away." The command was subtle, almost imperceptible. 12 hands rose in unison. The salute wasn't sharp. It was held, deliberate, weighted with meaning. Elena stood frozen. She didn't know what to do with her hands, with her breath, with the sudden burn behind her eyes. She had faced death, she had faced violence, she had faced loss. She had never faced recognition like this. "Ma'am," they said together. The word echoed, soft but absolute. Elena exhaled shakily. "I'm not," she started. Hale stepped forward again, lowering his salute. "You don't need to be anything else," he said. "You already were." He reached into his jacket and placed something in her hand. A coin, heavy, warm from his palm, engraved, worn at the edges. "This doesn't come with orders," he added, "just belonging." Her fingers closed around it instinctively. Ryan smiled faintly. "You saved the medic," he said, "which means you saved all of us." She looked at him, then at the others. Men trained for war. Men who had seen things she could only imagine. Men who had just stood in formation for her. Tears slipped free, despite her effort to hold them back. "I just did my job," she whispered. Hale met her gaze. "No," he said. "You did more than you were required to do. That's the difference." The formation broke quietly. No applause, no spectacle, just men stepping back into motion, into humanity. Around them, the hospital staff slowly dispersed, murmuring softly. Some smiled. Some wiped their eyes. No one needed an explanation. Elena stood there a moment longer, the coin heavy in her hand. This was supposed to be the end. Instead, it felt like a threshold. Later, as she walked back toward her car, Ryan's voice stopped her. "Elena," he called. She turned. "Next time you hear the word team," he said, "know that it includes you." She nodded, unable to speak. As she drove away, the hospital shrinking in her rearview mirror, she realized something profound and unsettling. She hadn't been honored because she was exceptional. She had been honored because she refused to be indifferent. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting. Sometimes it's standing still and saying, "Not today." And sometimes the final shift doesn't close a chapter. It reveals what the whole story was about. Why did the silence that followed feel louder than the salute itself? Like the world expected something from her she hadn't yet learned how to give. Elena sat in her car long after the engine started. The coin rested in her palm, heavy enough to remind her it was real, warm enough to remind her it had been given. She turned it slowly between her fingers, tracing the edges without reading the markings. Symbols didn't matter as much as weight. Meaning had mass. You could feel it when it was placed in your hand. Across the lot, the ambulance bay doors slid shut again. Ordinary motion, ordinary sound. The kind that usually told her it was time to move, time to respond, time to be useful. But there was no radio on her hip anymore. She closed her hand around the coin and let it rest against her thigh. Her wrist protested as she shifted, a sharp reminder that her body hadn't come away untouched. Neither had her sense of place. For years, her identity had been simple: EMT, partner, first in, last out. The job told her who she was, told her when to speak, when to act, when to leave. Now the job was gone and something else stood in its place, something without a uniform or a title. She drove home slowly, taking side streets she'd traveled 1,000 times in an ambulance, seeing them now through a different lens. These were the roads she used to race down with lights on, heart already 10 steps ahead. Now they were just roads, quiet, patient. At home, the house greeted her with stillness. No messages blinking on the answering machine. No boots by the door that needed cleaning. Just the familiar creak of the floorboard near the kitchen and the faint hum of the refrigerator. She set the coin on the counter beside her keys and stared at it for a long moment. Belonging, she thought, had always been conditional. You belonged as long as you showed up, as long as you could carry weight, as long as you didn't break. But this had been given after she'd fallen. She slept that afternoon, deep and dreamless at first, then restless. The alley came back in fragments, the sound of rain on metal, the feel of a wrist twisting free, the sudden, shocking absence of balance, but threaded through it was something new, not fear, not pain. Presence. She woke just before dusk, disoriented for a moment, then remembered. Retirement, the bay, the salute, the word ma'am spoken without irony or obligation. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. She stared at it, a familiar tension rising in her chest. She had answered calls like this her whole life, never knowing what waited on the other end. Some habits didn't retire easily. "Elena," Ryan Blake said when she answered. His voice was steadier now, still rough at the edges, but alive, fully alive. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He exhaled softly. "Like I got hit by a truck, which, all things considered, feels fair." She smiled faintly. "That means you're healing." "Yeah," he said. "Listen, I didn't want today to feel like pressure." "It didn't," she replied honestly. There was a pause. "It did to me," he admitted. "I've been trying to find the words since I woke up. Haven't had much luck." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said. She meant it. "I know," he replied. "That's why this is hard." Silence stretched between them, comfortable now. "You ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. "The job," she said. "Yes." She looked around her quiet living room. The framed photo on the shelf of her academy class faces younger, sharper. Some gone now, some changed beyond recognition. I miss parts of it, she said slowly. I don't miss who it demanded I be all the time. Ryan considered that. I think I understand. You will, she added gently, sooner than you think. After they hung up, Alina sat alone again, the sky outside darkening to deep blue. She realized something then that unsettled her more than the violence had. She didn't feel finished. Days passed, the city moved on, news cycles turned. The men who had attacked her were processed quietly, their names never making headlines. Alina attended her follow-up appointments, healed slowly, learned the patience she had never afforded herself before. Neighbors stopped her sometimes. Word had traveled in fragments. We heard something happened. You okay? She answered politely. Minimally, the story didn't belong to them. One afternoon, a small envelope appeared in her mailbox. No return address, just her name written neatly across the front. Inside was a single photograph. 12 men standing on a windswept coastline, backs to the camera, horizon wide in front of them. In the corner, handwritten, "Still here." She pressed the photo flat against the table, her chest tightening unexpectedly. She hadn't realized how often she wondered if they were okay, if Ryan was healing, if the team had gone back to places where staying alive required more than courage. Belonging, she realized, wasn't proximity. It was concern. That night, Alina dreamed she was back in the ambulance. The radio crackled. An address came through she didn't recognize. She reached for the mic and woke before she could answer. She lay there in the dark, heart steady, breath even. For the first time, she didn't feel pulled by the call. She felt trusted to let it go. Weeks later, she returned to the hospital one last time, not as staff, not as patient, as herself. She walked the halls slowly, nodding to familiar faces, exchanging quiet smiles. No speeches, no ceremony. She stopped at the ambulance bay and stood where she had bled. The concrete had been cleaned. The stain was gone. Life erased its marks quickly when it wanted to. She didn't. She reached into her pocket and felt the edge of the coin. Thought about all the times she had stood between danger and someone else without expecting acknowledgement. All the nights she had gone home bruised and silent, believing that was simply the cost. She understood now that some costs were noticed, even if you never sent an invoice. As she turned to leave, a young EMT jogged up, hesitating. "Ma'am," he said, unsure. She smiled at the word, "Yes." "I just wanted to say they tell your story in training now," he said. "About the alley, about staying." Alina blinked. "They shouldn't romanticize it." "They don't," he replied quickly. "They say it was messy, that you got hurt, that it scared people." He swallowed. "They say that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't look heroic, it just looks stubborn." She laughed softly. "That sounds about right." As she walked away, she felt something settle inside her. Not pride, not closure. Continuity. She hadn't saved the world. She hadn't changed the system. She hadn't even known who she was protecting. She had simply refused to abandon someone when it would have been easier to step back. And somehow, that refusal had rippled outward, touching lives she would never fully see. That night, Alina placed the coin beside her bed, not as a trophy, as a reminder. She didn't belong to the past. She belonged to the principle that had guided her all along. Sometimes, service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it just changes shape. And sometimes, the quiet that follows isn't emptiness. It's space, waiting to be filled with whatever comes next. Why did the road ahead feel wider than it ever had before, like she was finally allowed to choose where it led? Alina woke before dawn, not from pain this time, but from habit. For 30 years her body had learned the rhythm: wake before the city, breathe before the call. For a moment she lay still, listening for the radio that never came. The silence didn't disappoint her anymore. It simply existed. She sat up slowly, careful with her wrist, and reached for the coin on the nightstand. Her fingers closed around it, familiar now. It no longer felt heavy. It felt settled, like something that had found where it belonged. Outside, the sky was just beginning to change. The world always looked honest at that hour. No performances, no urgency yet, just possibility. Alina dressed and stepped outside with a cup of coffee she actually remembered to drink. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and stopped. She watched the steam rise from the mug and thought about how many mornings she'd started this way. Only back then, the calm had been borrowed, temporary. She known it would shatter as soon as the call came in. Now the calm was hers. Her phone buzzed mid-sip. A message, no number, just a photo. Ryan Blake stood on his own 2 feet this time, leaning slightly on a railing somewhere that looked like open water behind him. Sunlight cut across his face. He looked thinner, stronger in a quieter way. Beneath the photo, a line of text. Cleared for duty. Medics still standing. Thought you should know. Alina closed her eyes, exhaled slowly. She hadn't realized how much she'd been carrying that question with her, whether he'd return whole, whether the team would be complete again. She typed back before she could overthink it. Glad you're still standing. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Always will be, thanks to you. She didn't reply after that. Some things didn't need more words. Later that morning, Alina drove out of the city for the first time without a destination tied to duty. The highway opened up, lanes stretching toward low hills just starting to green after winter. She rolled the window down, letting cool air wash through the car. She thought about all the versions of herself that had existed over the years. The rookie who thought competence was armor. The veteran who learned that armor cracked no matter how careful you were. The woman who'd carried more stories than she ever shared. And the woman she was now, still healing, still human, but no longer defined by how fast she could respond. She stopped at a small overlook and stepped out, leaning against the guardrail. Below, the land unfolded quietly. No sirens, no commands, just space. For the first time, Alina allowed herself to ask a question she'd never had time for before. What comes next? The answer didn't arrive fully formed. It came in fragments, images, possibilities, teaching maybe, mentoring, standing beside people before they ever learned how heavy the job could be, helping without breaking herself in the process. She realized then that her strength had never been about endurance alone. It had been about presence. Days turned into weeks, her wrist healed, the stitches came out. The bruises faded into faint reminders she only noticed when the light hit just right. She started volunteering with a local training program, sitting in the back at first, listening, observing. When she spoke, people leaned in, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't need to. They asked about protocols, about decisions, about fear. She told them the truth. That fear never went away. That courage wasn't the absence of it. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stay still when everything in you wanted to step back. She never mentioned the salute unless someone asked directly. When they did, she kept it simple. They reminded me that doing the right thing doesn't require permission. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city softened into shadow, Alina found herself back at the ambulance bay again. Not to look back, just to acknowledge it. She stood where the concrete met the open air, where the doors had once parted to reveal 12 men in dress blues. The space was empty now, ordinary, functional. Perfect. She smiled faintly. Her phone buzzed once more. Chief Hale this time. Just a short message. Teams deploying again tomorrow. Wanted you to know, no matter where we go, your name goes with us. Alina stared at the words longer than she needed to. She felt no urge to cry, no swell of pride, just a deep, steady warmth that settled in her chest. She typed back, Then go and come back. There was no immediate reply. She didn't need one. As she walked back to her car, she understood something that had taken her a lifetime to learn. Legacy wasn't built in grand gestures. It was built in moments no one was supposed to see. In alleys behind bars, in decisions made without witnesses, in the choice to stand between harm and another human being without knowing their name, their rank, or their value to the world. She drove home under a sky streaked with fading light. The road was familiar now, but it didn't feel limiting. It felt open. That night, Alina placed the coin back on the nightstand and turned off the light. Darkness settled around her gently. She thought about the word they had used. Ma'am. Not as a title, not as hierarchy. As acknowledgement. Sleep came easily. And in that quiet, Alina Marquez finally understood what her final shift had given her. Not an ending. A truth. That strength doesn't always announce itself. That courage often looks ordinary. And that dignity, real dignity, doesn't shout. It simply acts.